Greetings, shalom, friends and fellow believers, and even if you're not a believer, thank you for clicking on Part 2, titled Last One Standing. And this is not meant to be some kind of action-packed, rough and tough, like the old Western shootouts, until the last one is standing, or as these modern action-packed movies are, with more computer animation and special effects. This is just a simple home video here with very meaningful teaching. And in Part 1, if you listened to Part 1, thank you very much. And if you haven't, please go back and listen to Part 1. You can catch it on YouTube, search for it, or go to our website at www.Torah, that's Torah, truthseekers.org. Not .com, but .org. And in Part 2, I'll continue, but as a quick refresher, in Part 1 I covered many very meaningful scriptures, even expounded upon and magnified some of the Greek words that are in the New Testament, as many of you refer it to. In Hebrew we call it the Brit Hadashah, simply means New Covenant. And very meaningful scriptures. And especially for those of you who've ever felt alone in your faith, or in standing up for what is right, and or standing against what is wrong. And so many times in life, whether we're believers or unbelievers, this can apply to us, but especially to those of us who are believers, who are learning and growing, and more we learn and study what is in the Word here, the more different we may become from society, or from the majority, from maybe even our own physical family members. And if that's the case, of course, we don't want division. We don't want to cause any problems or offenses to people, but the truth will, right? Sometimes the truth hurts. And the Word is like a two-edged sword. It can cut both ways, not only you, but me too. It gets to us all. We all have imperfection. We all have ways that we can improve and grow. And so, if ever you feel alone, there's many scriptures I covered in Part 1. And even our Messiah, I didn't cover in Part 1, but in, Matthew chapter 19 and verse 21. No, verse 29. He says here, "And everyone who has left houses, or brothers, or sisters, or father, or mother, or children, or lands, for my name's sake," for the sake of our Messiah, and His will, and His Word, and His truth, and whatever He's telling us to do and not to do. And He says, "Whoever does that shall receive 100-fold, in bearing good fruit, of course, and inherit eternal life." Encouraging words, even if we have to sometimes lose or forsake some of the things that are most important to us, as Abraham was willing to sacrifice his only son Isaac through his wife of wedlock, Sarah. And so we too sometimes have to give up what is most important to us. Not that we should want to, not that we try to, but just as we live the way, and as we follow His instructions, His Word. And Torah simply means instruction, or teachings. And so we go by the Torah, the instructions of our Creator, and also through His Word. And His Word became flesh, as I also covered in Part 1. But I wanted to also turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 in Part 2 here, and verses 11 and 12. And this is the Apostle Paul. His Hebrew name is Shaul. He wrote a lot of good words. I covered some of his writings in Part 1 and Messiah's, and it's interesting. They both taught the same things. Paul didn't come along and teach a whole new theology or try to do away or change the truth in any way, but simply grew and taught and brought both Jews and Gentiles together under the same body, same Spirit, same baptism. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul is covering in the earlier verses how Israel, they all went through the same sea, they all had the same rock, they all had the same cloud, and he points out how that rock was symbolic of the Messiah, and they drank of the same water, which was symbolic of the Spirit and the truth and in the way that they were going. And he points out that that is even a type of baptism, going through the sea, in verse 2 of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And notice how he says, now all these things happened to them. This is referring to Israel. These stories of what many of you refer to as the Old Testament, or in Judaism we understand it as the Tanakh, and the oracles. They're simply the oracles, the holy writings that have been preserved through the millenniums, through the hundreds of years. And so here Paul says all these examples happened to them for examples, and they were written for our admonition. Myself, you, and who else here? Upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So this is referring to the end of the age. It's going to be more applicable even to the end of this age, which is very interesting. When we look back to these stories, we look at Enoch, we look at Noah. Were they a minority? Were they kind of alone? Were they standing alone in the faith, in the truth? We can read about them in Hebrews chapter 11, the faith chapter. And there's Abraham, we talked about him, and also Joshua and Caleb, the only two from their generation that went into the promised land. It was the next generation that went across with them. But as you know, they were in the wilderness, in the Sinai desert in Arabia there for 40 years. And then they were finally able to cross. And then there's Gideon's army. Remember Gideon? And our Creator kept saying, oh, too many. Let's narrow it down. Let's narrow down those who are afraid. Let them go back. Those who are not drinking the water wisely, let them go back, and so forth. And we can see that numbers are not the most important thing. It should not be the main thing that influences us. Our main influence should come from His Word, His truth, what is right and what is wrong. Job, remember the adversary was accusing the earth of all this corruption all over again, and in Job chapter 1, our Creator told him, the Almighty said, well, have you considered Job? He's blameless, and he's upright. And so he was able to stand alone. And he had family too. There's also Elijah. Remember Elijah? I covered that a little bit in part 1, how he thought he was all alone, and the Almighty said, well, there's 7,000 others who have not bowed to Baal, or these pagan deities, or paganism. And so, sometimes we feel alone, and this message is meant to pump you up, to hopefully encourage you to walk forward, whether you have a majority around you walking in the faith and in the truth, or whether you don't. It's great to have fellowship. It's great to have other believers. We can sharpen each other as iron sharpens iron, as my wife and kids and our friends and their families and the local congregation, we try to encourage one each other. But we go to school, we go to work. Regardless, there are times when we are outnumbered by unbelievers. And not that we should fear that, but that we should not be influenced in a wrong way. So hopefully these two messages, part 1 and this part 2, can be encouraging to you. And Paul says here in verse 12, continuing in chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, he says, "Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall." So we got to be careful. I'm confident sometimes, too confident. I can stand, I can be in this environment or this influence, and it won't get to me. But he says, "Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed." Be careful, because we can all fall. Don't get overconfident. And always realize how much we are weak without his help and without any kind of correspondence and iron sharpening iron and encouragement we can do for each other as believers when we can. And that's always a good thing. So I want to conclude in Joshua, since I mentioned him. In Joshua chapter 24 and verse 15. Here's Joshua. And of course the letter J wasn't pronounced in Hebrew. It's not pronounced in the Hebrew language. It would be more like Yahshua. And like our Messiah. It's similar. It's the same thing. It means Yah is salvation. And in Joshua chapter 24 verse 15 it says, and here he's speaking to Israel, "And if it seems evil to you to serve the Almighty, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve." You got to choose. Even I got to choose. Even today. So let this scripture speak to us today too. "Whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river." Now interesting, even our fathers, our family members, and who we have today, if they are not following the same Almighty Creator and Ruler of this universe, then let's not follow their gods. But let's do what's right and try to love one another. We're supposed to even love our enemies. Our Messiah says to love our enemies. How much more so should we love our own family, our friends who are unbelievers? Try to be a good light, an ambassador, a good example to the whole world, to everybody, and to seek peace with all, and not just those who are believers. So we shouldn't be self-righteous or condemning or have the wrong attitude towards our fellow human beings. We're all created in his image and after his likeness. And so I want to say that, of course. But here, notice the river. They crossed the Jordan River. As we talked about earlier, the river water is symbolic of the Spirit. And when they went through the sea, and the Almighty parted the sea so that they could go right through it, and the Egyptians got crushed in, when God closed up the sea, that was a form of baptism, that Israel was saved and brought into a newness of life and brought to the covenant at Mount Sinai that the Creator wanted with them, the marriage covenant. And now he wants a marriage covenant, what we call a new covenant, with us, but it's still based upon faithfulness, as we want faithfulness in any covenant that we engage in, whether it be a marriage or a business covenant or contract. There has to be faithfulness to that. And here we see baptism. Here they go through the river, and he says here the gods of the Amorites are over there, and in whom the land that is dwelling. So he says, "But as for me and my house, we will serve Yud-He Vav-He." Now that's just the Hebrew letters without any vowels, how you'd say the Hebrew letters Y-H-V-H. And it's pronounced in different ways with different Hebrew dialects today, as we've talked about. Many people feel that name is too sacred to say, and so they say Adonai, which is the Hebrew name for Lord. But we all know who we're talking about here. We will serve Him. We want to make our lives all about Him and His Son. and we want to walk in the light, in the truth. And as I pointed out in part 1 of this video message teaching, in Luke chapter 18 and verse 18, no, Luke 18 and in verse 8, probably one of the most profound questions of the whole holy word here, the book. Our Messiah asks this question, and I covered it in part 1. I'll conclude with it in part 2 because it's such a profound question. Think and meditate on this question. When the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? And it doesn't say will he find faith. Will he really find faith in you?